Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar in which we're going to be talking about games and quizzes, which is a type of play-based learning that you can use with any age group, whether it's from the real youngins right up into adults, and especially with adults and high school kids and primary school kids, because quite often we think of games and quizzes, it only really gets used in lower primary or early childhood, but I think there are some important reasons for why games and quizzes can be used with a whole range of different age groups. And I'll go through some of those in a minute, but I just wanted to give you one little tip that I think is a really important tip, and it's certainly going to help you. When I first started teaching, I thought that there was such a huge plethora and large number of games and quizzes and things that you could possibly choose from, that how could you ever know which is the right one or which is the best one or what kids would like to do. But in actual fact, I really think there's probably only about 3 or 4 different games that 95% of teachers use most of the time. And you'll know what most of those are if you've spent any period of time in a school. Silent ball is one of them. Oh, that's my personal favourite. I'll go through that one with you in a moment. There's always the traditional heads down, thumbs up type of approach, and there's various different ones where you have students laying on the floor perfectly still and silent, which I right now can't remember the name of. So, but point is, you only need to know 3 or 4 different games. You don't need to know 600 or 700 of them, or even 50 or 10 of them. You have a few games and a couple of types of quizzes that are really that you know how to do really well, and you practice them over and over again with different groups of students or with the same group of students and slowly train them in how to perform that activity, just like you do any other lesson, so that they know what the rules are, their expectations are, and how the procedure works. Now, the goal particularly with games, but also with quizzes, but one of the main goals of using these activities, well, not the main goals, but one of the reasons behind using these activities is so that students can continue to learn and consolidate their knowledge. So sometimes we use games as an introduction, sometimes it's at the end as a consolidation, and sometimes it's just quite simply a time waster. So we use it just to fill in time, particularly at the end of term or the end of day or whatever. So students are still getting a little bit of consolidation, but you'll get a good feel for when they're not going to be concentrating a huge deal for whatever reason. And at that point, a game might come in handy. Games are also really handy for if you want students to calm down, because the actual opposite happens to what you would think. You would think if you get students up out of their seats and they're moving around and doing things, that they would become overly excited, and that could make things more difficult from a behaviour management perspective. But actually, quite often what happens is the complete opposite, and it settles students down, particularly if they come in from lunch or whatever. They've been running around playing sport. There might have been a fight that's got them all excited and revved up. Playing some type of game can be a good way to bridge that playground to classroom divide. Obviously, it's much more effective to get students in silent reading or something like that to calm them down. But games for the right class do serve their purpose. So I highly recommend learning 3 or 4 games and knowing them inside out and the different variations, because you do change the variation up depending on who you're working with and what grade that you're working with. So I used to play silent ball with I used to play with all different groups. I've even taught a birth to 4 class once because the teacher was away in a district school that I was at. But mainly I've taught year 1 through to year 12, and I've also spent a lot of time teaching adults. Silent ball is something that I've used with pretty much every group. And it's a really good activity because 1, it's silent, and 2, you get those students who like playing ball games and sports and are a little less academic. They're very much inclined and enjoy playing these types of games. And silent ball, if you haven't heard of it, obviously is silent. If anyone makes any noise whatsoever, then they're out. And the idea is that students randomly stand around the room. You might have to put them around the room and move them around a little bit to stand in specific places, and they throw the ball backwards and forth randomly to each other. And if anyone makes a noise, they're out and they sit down. If anyone drops the ball or throws the ball in a way that is a bad throw, then they are also out. And of course, you could have 2 balls going at the same time, and you could add in various other different variations, like you could add some multiplication practice or some language practice into it as well. So a student says, what is 4 times 2, and throws the ball, and the person that they throw it to has to give the answer before they catch it. So there are lots of different creative ways that you can integrate these type of activities, and that leaves me to a term called movement integration, or MI. Now, amongst researchers, educational researchers, if you read a lot of academic type literature like I do, movement integration is very well known. But if you talk to teachers, you will almost never have someone say that they have heard of this particular term before. It's not something that many teachers or teacher aides or education professionals who are working in classes are aware of. And it's not even a new concept. It's not an old concept like most of the concepts in education, but it has been around for some time. And movement integration, there's a lot of research behind it that does show that it is highly effective. And basically it means that you're playing a game. Now, a game that involves movement, actually, because a lot of games, similar to quizzes, so quizzes is really a type of game, right? A lot of games can just be paper-based, like bingo and various different things like that, like we play when we're trying to teach kids second languages and maths and things. But this type of game, or not, it's actually not even necessarily a game, but when it involves movement of some description. So by the nature, I would say that it would be some type of game, whether it has that competitive element or not, maybe not. So that's known as movement integration. Basically, it means you're trying to get students out of their seats somehow and getting them to move as part of that teaching and learning process. And there is a lot of research that shows that that does have a significantly positive effect on the learning outcomes. And by positive, we mean their recall in the future, their ability to recall the types of activities that they did and what they learned, and the feedback from the teacher or the teacher aide or whoever. They enjoy it more, so they're more engaged. Time passes a lot faster, which in a good way, and also that their conceptual understanding improves as well. Now, there's probably some physiological things happening there in the brain, but that leads me to the next thing that I'm going to talk about, and that's why games are so important. Because I think a lot of people naturally think that just having games and quizzes is just something that you do for a bit of fun or whatever, but there are actually some very important pedagogical reasons for why integrating games into your lessons and activities and into your sequences of learning, whatever you want to call them, whether it's units of work or courses or whatnot, workshops, seminars, whatever you're doing, it is important to add in games for a variety of different reasons. It's not to say that you have to, but it's to say that you should consider games as one of your teaching strategies, not just as something to waste time, but obviously it can be a time waster. And that's not necessarily a good thing, but in reality, wasting time sometimes is just what you need to do to survive the day. If you're teaching a group of, year 6 kids and it's the very last day on a Friday, for the whole school term, everything's been packed up, everything's been done for the year, half the kids are away anyway, a game might be a good way, a nice light-hearted way to finish off the term, because one, they're engaged in that activity as opposed to doing something else like colouring in or any other time waster, so it might help prevent issues. So whether it's best practice or not, teachers do, and teacher aides and other educational professionals do use time wasters, not constantly, not all the time, but they do use them. So, let's just be honest about that. Now, another reason why games are important is because it does get the blood flowing, right? So there is a physiological effect. Hopefully I spelled that one right. I hope that's right. There is a physiological effect for when students get up and start moving around. Now, I've never actually seen any academic type research on that. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. That isn't an area that I spend huge amounts of time researching or looking into. But there is a physiological effect, and certainly it is well known that if you're going for a walk, or what in the corporate world, what do they call that? There's a term for it when people go for walks and have a walking meeting. Anyway, so it is well known that being active does something in the brain that lets you come up with ideas and create things and conceptualize things and think of things in different ways. So certainly there's the physiological effect that playing games while learning or moving around while learning at the same time has on your ability to take that information from short-term memory to be able to put it into long-term memory and to be able to conceptualize it. New topic. I'll just write a few up here. So that's an intro. We've got quite a few more to go. So one of the reasons for why we use games and quizzes is to introduce a new topic. We use it to introduce a new topic so that it can just be a fun sort of icebreaker, which actually is another one. Time waster. And up here, I'm just going to add break. So it actually just gives the teacher something of a break. And it also gives students a break as well. So you can use games and quizzes to just get students out of their seat, get them to do something, even for 5 or 10 minutes of a 2-hour lesson or whatever, just to let them stretch and to, again, get the blood flow and so on, to give not only the students a break from whatever they're doing, but to give the teacher a break from having to go through the process of teaching, particularly on more difficult classes or with classes that require a lot of mental energy. If you're teaching, say, year 11s and 12s on a topic that is quite difficult or whatnot. So there are reasons why just having a bit of a break for 5 minutes in the middle improves focus and things like that. So it can be used as an icebreaker. It can also, at the very start, so that's, for example, when you get brand new students in a brand new class, that's pretty obvious. We've all been to professional development seminars and things like that where they would have done some type of icebreaker. But we do commonly use them to introduce new topics and also to consolidate. So if you have a lesson, your standard lesson plan here, and you might use it right here, you might just do a 5-10 minute game at the very start. Or you might actually do one at the end here. We were talking about having a bit of a break where it's in the middle. So this is chronologically, the lesson goes like this from 0 minutes to say 120 minutes. Let's say it's a 2-hour lesson. So at some point in there, integrating some type of, or using some type of movement integration might be useful. So you can just keep that as part of your bag of tricks, I guess you could say. Now, of course, even if you're teaching adults, which sometimes they'll do, say, a 3-hour session, and there'll usually be a toilet break in the middle or something like that, you can still have some type of game or a little quiz or something for 5 minutes in the middle there, just to take people, not necessarily take people's mind off it because it will be related to the topic you're doing, but just to try and make things a little bit more light-hearted, and so that they're still learning and consolidating knowledge, but in a bit of a fun way as well. Okay, so introducing topics and consolidation at either end of that lesson is important, and icebreaker as well. We'll go blue. Sorry, I'll be done in 2 seconds. Okay, cool. So I just wanted to write up a few more and then we're pretty much done for this particular list. So obviously another thing is motivation, because if students are enjoying being in class, then they're going to want to come back for more, particularly if they're hitting goals. And you can use games as an opportunity. You can use games as an opportunity for goals and formative assessment. So as you know, formative assessment simply means that you're providing feedback to students, and goals is simply, particularly those micro goals. So if you've got, on this particular lesson here, you've got 3 goals that you want to achieve. 3 things you want them to learn or whatever. You play a little game here and you're providing feedback to students on those 3 goals. So through a game or a quiz or something like that, you can integrate those goals in there, which obviously helps students with motivation. But so if you get students that come in and you have to do reading or writing or maths or something where they really don't want to do that particular topic, then if you can come up with a way to put at least some type of game in there, even if it's not a full-on sports activity type thing, but some type of game, then obviously that's going to help with student motivation. It can obviously be used as a reward, as a part of some type of education plan or whatever. Quite often teachers will use it down here so that throughout the lesson they can use it as a bit of a carrot for students to behave and to work well so that we've got enough time. That's normally how it's phrased. If we get on and do our work here, then we'll have enough time because I've got a fun game that we want to play at the end. Memory, as I was saying before, with movement integration, getting people moving around, the ability to take information and concepts and knowledge and move it from short term to long term because of the different concepts, the different context from which that learning occurs, students are able to more easily take that information and put it into long-term memory. We've been through formative assessment. I've got a video on that. I've got a video on that. I've got a video on that. I've got a video on that which relates to rewards. So I'd go through and watch those ones. Now, stress, obviously, particularly in this day and age where there's a high proportion of students who are overweight or not exercising or are very stressed and very anxious, any way that you can help students reduce stress can certainly help. And I think playing games is certainly a way that you can try and achieve that. Just getting people, and you know what it's like when you're feeling a little stressed out and you just get up and you move around a little bit. You just feel a little bit better. That dopamine and all those other hormones start flowing, and you just feel that little bit happier. So helping students reduce stress is important, and also bearing in mind, generally speaking, we are requiring students to sit down for longer and not longer and longer, but they've always been required to sit down for really long periods of time. And I always like to remind teachers and teacher aides to think about what it was like when you were a student, or what it was like if you're learning something. So if I said, okay, here's this book on this topic that you don't really care about, let's say management accounting, I want you to go and read that book for an hour non-stop in absolute silence. You're allowed to put your hand up and ask 2 or 3 questions. And if you say that you want to go to the toilet, then I'm probably going to embarrass you in front of your peers and ask you, why you go so often or whatever. So I'm being a bit silly there, but you get the point that sometimes we treat students in certain ways that if you treated adults in those ways, it would sound very strange. And sitting down and reading, I'm not really a reader of novels and things, but for those, some people can sit down and read novels for 20, 30, 50 hours a week. But for those of us who don't enjoy that, being forced to do something like that, the half an hour of having to do that silently would be like grating our fingers across a blackboard. So just bear that in mind, that students are under a lot of pressure, particularly in high schools, but even in primary schools, if they are required to work on very difficult topics, because learning something is difficult. Learning any new body of knowledge or new skills is difficult. And you would know that for, if you had to install something in your house, like a new piece of furniture or, a lock on a door, or fix something, and you're following instructions, it can be, as you're trying to learn how to do whatever that task is, it can be very, very, very frustrating. So, but yet when students experience frustration and act it out, we generally call that a behavioural problem. So just bear that in mind, that you can certainly help reduce stress and obviously anxiety. Games help you build rapport. That also relates to the icebreaker here. And that positive classroom dynamic. So there's that word positive again. Positive classroom dynamic. Yeah, which means it's just like a nice atmosphere to be there. So, and conducive to learning is another term that is quite common. So now, if you are playing any games with students, I generally prefer the idea of using the same playing the same games on a regular basis. So I wouldn't play 10 different games once a week. Well, one game in week 1, one game in week 2, one game in week 3. I usually prefer, where possible, and particularly in primary schools or high schools, maybe not so much for adults, is to use the same game for week 1, the same game in week 2, maybe then week 4, maybe then week 6 or something like that. I usually don't like to jump around and do one thing this week and one thing next week, because it becomes a bit, not tricky, but I like to get students into routines. So if you are playing a game, they know what the expectations are, like any activity that you do, and there are rules and processes and routines, right? And there are consequences and so forth. So if you were, say you were playing silent ball with a group of students, then the discussion at the start would probably go something along these lines. Right, we're going to play silent ball today. Everyone knows what silent ball is. I just want to remind you of the rules. Obviously, if you make any sound, you are out, and that is any sound as I, being the judge, judges it to be the case. Remembering that if you argue with the judge, you are out, and that's it. So there's no arguing with the referee. If you throw the ball or do anything stupid, then I'm more than likely not going to let you play this game or the next game in the future. So there are logical consequences for that, and we have to, if we're going to do this instead of doing this other stuff, writing essays or whatever, then I need to make sure that everyone is on ball and playing with playing fairly and playing appropriately. Okay, so I want everyone to move around the classroom when I say go, not yet, when I say go, and to quietly stand in a spot that is at least that and then half of that again away from their friends. Now, if you stand near your friends, I will move you. So I recommend that you find a spot in the room, and so on and so forth. So you're setting it up and you've got very clear expectations. You might even do a pre-correction there where you're further correcting students as they're all set out. Then you're looking around, you're going, you can move there and you can move there. Now remember the rule, the number one rule, I am the referee. You do what I say. No arguing whatsoever or we don't play this game again, because as soon as people start arguing with the referee, it's no longer silent. So putting your foot down and playing games in is still a lesson. It's still an activity. And just like any activity that you're doing, there are risks associated with that, particularly if you're teaching some types of students, such as those with autism, can have meltdowns and things. So it's really important to make sure that you've got very clear rules, expectations, processes, routines, consequences. One of the reasons for that, by the way, is because all that equals independence. So independence, if you can read that horrible mess, means that after a few games, remember how I was saying before that I like to do the same game week 1, 2, 3, 5 or whatever. You're repeating, not too often, but you can do it often enough, because students eventually become good enough at that game. They know the expectations, they know the rules, so on and so forth. They know how to go through that process without you as the teacher or teacher aide having to facilitate it. So then you really do get a break, and they also get a break from you as well. So you can still be there. Obviously, you're not going to leave and go and get a coffee at the staff room or something, but it means that you can just sit back and relax a little bit and let students manage the process themselves. So anyway, those things there, once you've drilled them into students, develops that independence so that they can run a 15-minute game or so thereabouts, or whatever it takes, on their own with very little effort from the teacher's perspective. But yet, if you were doing a different game every single week, then they would never develop that independence. So that's just an important thing to bear in mind. Okay, that's that taken care of. Now, I just wanted to have a quick chat about quizzes, because quizzes are my favourite game, if you want to call them a game, I guess. Maybe by trade I'm a high school teacher, so I have a bit of a bias here, but I really do like doing quizzes. And quizzes are one of those things that the more you do them, the better you're going to get at delivering them. They do take some effort. particularly early on with classes. And the same applies with games, as I was saying, that you can go through that process of setting clear rules and expectations and so on and so forth. That is really important. So for example, when you're going through, before you start asking questions, you need to tell students, do not look at your friends' answers. Do not give your friends any of your answers. Do not call out an answer. If you call out an answer to prove how smart you are, what that means is that one, I have to change the question, and two, you get that and another question automatically incorrect. If you do it multiple times, then you are out of the game. Plus, you're just actually being quite rude and selfish. So that's probably one of the number one rules that I always enforce. And whether we like it or not, unfortunately, there's always an adult in an adult class who always feels the need to accidentally call out the answer as well. So that's something that you need to remind people of quite regularly. I mainly used to do this with high school kids, but you can adjust it and do it for almost any grade. You might struggle a bit in maybe year 1 or 2 or something like that, but you can do various different iterations of a quiz. So the other rule that is really important with quizzes is as we go through the answers the other rule is that as I call out the question, I'll call it out multiple times. So I'll say it once at normal pace, I'll wait 3 or 4 seconds, I'll repeat it, do not talk during that time or ask any questions, and I'll go through at the very end all of the questions really quickly. So I always say that at the end, that you've got another opportunity at the very end to go through it. The other thing I do with quizzes is I time myself quite stringently. I don't actually look at the clock, but I do make sure that I give enough time there, but not too much time. So usually say 30 seconds or a minute or in between, depending on how difficult the question is. Something along those lines. Now, when you're going through the answers at the end with students, you can get them to swap, of course, but it's really important that you're also structuring the way in which you go about doing that as well, so that you're saying, okay, I am the arbiter, I'm the one who gets to decide, I'm the referee, I'm the one who gets to decide whether you get it right or wrong, there's no arguing, and so forth. Now, obviously, you can be quite strict, like the examples I've given so far, quite stern. Over time, you wouldn't need to be as stern. It's just like, right, guys, quick reminder type of thing. So depending on the behaviour of class and what's going on and what you're expecting. But I think with quizzes and games, you have to really make sure that you are very strict with those rules and making sure students are following them, because there's always one or two that are happy to try and wreck it for everyone else, and I think that's quite unfair. So. Okay, now with quizzes, there's a couple of things that I like to do. So one of the most important things is, let's say we're doing a maths quiz, right? Now, I like to integrate questions that are kind of tricky and that boost students' general knowledge, but also gives them an option to bring in ideas, or I'd say bring in knowledge from outside of that particular class. So if you're in a maths class, there are students in there who you are trying to motivate who might not be doing too well. You don't want them to score 0 out of 10. So generally you would start with something super easy, and you might do a couple of easy ones because they're kind of your revision questions. And they can, depending on the students, they can be ridiculously easy. Another thing you should look at in relation to this is this. Bloom's taxonomy, and the other video I've got, questioning skills or techniques, whatever I called it. Because that's effectively what you're doing here, right? Asking questions. Okay, so you would probably do a couple of easy ones. You would probably also I would add in something fun. So let's call it a general knowledge one. Right, and I usually do a couple of them. Right, a general knowledge one. Now, that can be something about a reality TV show that's on at the moment. It can be a little fact-based thing that's, say, historical or whatnot. But you're really aiming to try and give students a good amount of marks. That's what you're trying to do here. Don't forget, you can follow up with these quizzes later on and do a variety of other different things afterwards. So quizzes quite often are used to lead into other activities and discussions, but you want to get students in. You want them to have buy-in at the very start. Of course, you can play around this and manipulate it. Usually what I'll do is I'll do one general question, but I might add in another one later on when we get to question 9 or something like that. This is just going to be out of 10, so something relatively simple. So they're your easy ones, and revision, but I'm thinking like revision from way back when. So something to give them a guaranteed 2 marks. And this one, you want students to probably get 50%. So you want them to get maybe one will be, might say, a TV thing or something like that. And another one might be, I don't know, something that you think they should know, but maybe they don't. Like, what was the name of the first person who stepped on the moon, or the second person, or something like that. Okay, now number 5, I would add something in that is actually revision, but for this topic. So the example I always use is Venn diagrams. So I would say we might even draw one of these on the board. Again, you're revising, and you might, let's say you've got different points there, and you would say how many, let's say this is one category of people, this is another category of people, and there are 2 overlaps there. Let's make it 3. How many people fall into that category as well as that category? So that kind of might be the question. You wouldn't draw that, maybe you draw that as a diagram, but you wouldn't point to the 2. So that could be tall people, that could be short people, and the middle one could be people who live in rural areas. I don't know, I'm just making this up, right? So you would say how many people live in rural areas and are tall, or something like that. That's probably a silly example, but again, you're giving students an opportunity to really conceptualise the answers there, or to revise what you've done in a previous lesson, because if they can do that one, then let's say you do number 6 that's slightly harder, which involves 1, 2, and maybe a third one, or you could do a third one there, right? So let's say we did something like that. So maybe you could do it that's just that little bit harder, but you can use this as a formative assessment task to really, or activity, to really figure out where students are at and whether they have achieved what you wanted them to achieve in previous lessons. Now, quite often with quizzes, I also like to integrate or to add questions in. Yes, is that revision? Because there's another spaced learning. There's another video that I've done called Spaced Learning. Now that one is really important. Please look up spaced learning and why that's relevant to revision. So why it's important if you've got a timeline. I don't know what I'm drawing there. Why that's important. Because if you've got, say you've done 10 topics over a time. So this is week 1, this is week 10. If you've done all these topics here, if you teach something here, they're not going to remember it here, even if they, well maybe, but very unlikely. So you need to be constantly revising it at different points. So quizzes is a really good way to be able to achieve that. So yeah, spaced learning, also known as disturbed learning, but I call it spaced learning. So, okay, and then we've got 3 more questions remaining. Personally, I like to add in a trick question of sorts. Don't have to. We've got 4 questions remaining, right? So I'm going to do 2 more of the revision. I'm going to do another revision question there. Now, I'll do something of a trick question here and a general question here. And then the final one, we're going to do a challenge. Yeah, whatever. No, I suppose I better spell it properly. Some type of challenge one. Maybe I'll even give bonus points for that there. So the other thing too, this is just to give you a general idea. I don't set them out exactly like this. I almost never actually write down. In fact, I never write down what my questions are going to be before I do them. I usually just do them as I go. And I think most experienced teachers, particularly once you've done 4 or 5 quizzes, you'll kind of get a feel for how to do it. And you'll know, what some easy revision is from last lesson. You might add in a 3 times 2 plus 6 divided by 2, something like that, to try and trick students, because obviously they have to do that bit there and that bit there. When it comes to this kind of, I call it a trick one, but it's not. I usually put a spelling thing in, even if it's a maths one. So spelling words like ask a student to spell definitely, because pretty much no one ever spells the word definitely correct. And again, you can mix them up and you can sort of move it around, and it depends on how much time that you've got. I think in some of the other videos I normally say quizzes take anywhere up to 40 or 50 minutes. So you can, to begin with, your quizzes might be really quick and it won't take you very long, but over time, it takes 2 or 3 minutes to get it set up. There's a 2 or 3 minute transition at the end. So we're already at 3 minutes at the start, 3 minutes at the end. You've got 10 questions to go through. So let's say each one of those takes a minute and a half. So there's another 15 minutes. Then you're going through the answers. There's another 10 minutes. Then you're going through, there are certain sections that you want to spend a little bit of extra time on and explain to students and whatever. So let's say there's another 10 minutes there. For some of these answers, you want to bounce off students. And so watch that video on questioning skills about prompting and bouncing, where you bounce an answer across like this. And for some of these, when I'm actually going through them, we'll use them to generate more advanced questions. So you could add in a bonus point for, say, this one here, particularly if you said, okay, just quickly, I'm going to add in an extra question, and then you did another one there that students could go through. Or you could even just say, just off the top of your head, while we're on this topic, can anyone tell me why or what we would do, or yada, yada, yada. So while you've got their attention, they think they're playing a game effectively, but you're actually using this to teach them something. So you can see why that would take up an extra 5 minutes. If you want to get some students to come up on the board and write their answers up, that's also another good way to do it. That's going to waste a bit more time, but those students that do come up are then going to, for that particular question, they're going to remember the answer that they put for a long, long time. So even if it's a general knowledge thing, that student that comes up and answers that question is going to remember the fact that they did that for quite some time. So it's a good way to, it's a good consolidation tool, I guess you could say. And if I was just to add that up, let's say those 2 3s was 5 minutes just to do it. So that's 20, 30, 40, 50. So that's 50 minutes there, just like that, just with 10 questions. And you could imagine if you did 15 or 20 questions or whatnot. And these are very basic ones too. So if we were to do a quiz and we wanted to make it less basic, then it could take a little bit longer. So if you made the last 3 questions a little bit more complex, if you were doing physics or you were doing, or whatever topic it is, you might get students to write a couple of sentences or a paragraph. And then you go around and give them a score or something like that. So there's various other ways that you can do it. Now, the other thing with games as well is, quizzes, is you can collect these at the end. So there's nothing, usually you will swap with the partner and they'll mark that's the best way to do it. They'll give a score. Afterwards, a bunch of students will say, what about this and what about that and da-da-da-da-da. So you'll go through that sort of judging process, and then you can collect them up and keep them and then record. I wouldn't actually record them as a score because it is not a summative assessment, but you can use them to quickly run your eyes over and see where students are going. You can use them to show parents and so forth. So there are various different ways in which you can use quizzes. They have lots of different purposes, and I think they are a really good way of achieving those lesson goals or activity goals and units of program goals. It's an important part of that overall process. Even for people like me who follow the more traditional explicit teaching instructional sort of process, most of the time I still like doing quizzes and games and play-based learning not as often as possible, but I do integrate that into that more traditional approach. This bit up here, by the way, how I showed that it goes for about 50 minutes, that doesn't mean it has to. You could easily do that over a 15-minute period or a 7-minute, maybe not a 7-minute period, but you could do it over a very shorter period of time if you really wanted to. Now, just one final thing about quizzes as far as the logistics of running a quiz. Obviously, you can do that with, you probably wouldn't do it with one student, but I guess you could. But you could do it with small groups of students. You can do it with a group, a large whole of class type thing. There's various different ways that you can do quizzes. And generally what I do at the end, and this is relatively common, is ask students to put their hand up if they scored 4 or more, and leave their hand up, 5 or more, 6 or more, 7 or more, 8 or more. And you can decide if you give them some type of feedback there. Well, you will give them some type of feedback. So at the end, you'll give them a feedback to the whole class, as well as maybe you'll choose 2 or 3 individuals to provide feedback to as a motivational tool. I did a video on feedback skills and feedback techniques, so please watch that one. But also, it's up to you to make the decision if you'd like to provide some type of no-cost reward or a cost reward, like you buy something from the $2 shop or whatnot for whoever scores the best or whoever you think deserves it for that day. Obviously, if you're going to do that, you'd probably let students know at the start that you've got a little prize. But again, you don't have to go down that road. It's not necessarily, and in that sense, you're not bribing students or blackmailing students as is commonly thought to be associated with those extrinsic rewards. You're just adding a bit more fun into that competition and into that activity. It gives students something to aim towards, because you'd be amazed that even something as simple as stickers or very cheap things like that even adults will really work hard for. Something as simple as year 11s, year 12s will work really hard for something as simple. Anything that is recognition and acknowledgement that they have achieved to a high standard. Okay, so that is my take on games and quizzes. Thank you for watching.